Good afternoon, how's your day been? Welcome back to Gooner Fanzine TV. The reason I can't stop smiling is because we've got such a special guest, someone who is just written on Arsenal for so many years, someone who knows the club inside out, someone who's a top journalist and an amazing person as well to boot, Amy Lawrence. Thank you so much for your time, Amy, and your patience in coming on.
God, I don't know what to say after that intro.
The checks in
going
post.
about the colour of this.
But yeah, obviously Amy's written for the Gooner in the past. She's obviously doing great stuff at the Athletic now. The reason we're having a little chat, a little trip down memory lane, a bit of nostalgia, is Amy's book that's out. Arsenal's greatest moment told in her own words, as Tony Adams says, 89 basically. Thank you so much for being on, Amy. You're obviously involved in the DVD and the film, 89 the film. That sort of was that a natural progression in terms of the book afterwards?
As it turned out, it was quite odd because I was negotiating at the same sort of time on the film and the book, and both sort of projects were bubbling along. But as you know from when you have something like this, you're trying to get off the ground. It's not always plain sailing. It can take a little while, a bit of toing and froing. And I was thinking, neither of them might happen, both of them might happen, one of them might happen. And it transpired that they were both on offer. And I thought, there's no way that I'm going to not have a nervous breakdown, if I try and do a film that I've never really, not the most experienced filmmaker in the world, and write a book on the same subject at the same time and meet deadlines, and plus do other work and attempt to not let my family completely fall apart at the same time. So I realised that the only sensible way of not having a complete failure in all departments was to do one thing at a time. So the film was the thing that took off the most quickly, and in many ways it was a perfect sort of pattern to do things, because part of making the film, we sat down with all these iconic Arsenal figures from that time. You're talking to George Graham or Tony Adams or Michael Thomas or whoever it is for a couple of hours or maybe more, and the level of detail and material was just amazing. And the other thing that was just incredible about it when we were filming them was it was I can't compare it to many things, but it was very obvious that talking to people about this, talking to someone about their favourite thing, makes them talk in a different way. Right. And because you don't necessarily, even though, for example, Michael Thomas might have 10 people, 20 people a week will come up to him and say, oh, that goal, oh, how was that goal, how did it feel, da-da-da. And you sort of glaze over and have a stock response to something that's so routine. Actually sitting down and talking about it in depth and really stopping and thinking about it, people sort of went to a different space. It was like unlocking a memory box that was really deep. And there were times when we were asking somebody something, and there'd be quite a few people in the room, because you've got the cameraman and the sound producer and the director and various other, staff behind the scenes, and everybody was like this. And it was like you couldn't even breathe, because the intensity of their memories was so deep. Yeah. So as we're doing this, we know that there's 80% of stuff that isn't going to make the film, because you've got a finite amount of time and you've got to tell a story. And when you're telling a story for a film that people are watching, if you go off in different directions all the time, it becomes quite difficult for people to keep track and pay attention. So if you've got a film where it's moving forward, the director described it as being like on a train. You've got to keep going on the train tracks. You can't just flip off. And whereas with a book, you can go all over the place. So it enabled me to revisit some of this golden material we never got to use, and let it breathe and let it sing and give it an opportunity to come out into the world rather than being left on a cutting room floor. So that was great.
Absolutely. I mean, talking about intensity, it certainly starts that way with the feelings sort of intro, really, from an anonymous Arsenal fan. And he sort of talks about the way Arsenal literally practically saved his life through that game. That was a powerful start to the book.
Yeah, not kidding. I mean, Glenn, we'll talk about this a bit later, the story that never was. But one of the things, again, I thought was vital was the book had to be differentiated from the film. There was no point just making writing out in words what people have possibly already seen. The whole point was to have more layers and more experiences to provide a kind of broader spectrum, if you like, of experience through the book. A different one, it's obviously not visual, but I think it packs a different kind of emotional punch. And I thought that the one thing we couldn't really explore in too much depth in the film was fan moments. And I just know from talking to people over the years, the amount of people that come up to you when you're chatting and what were you doing that night? And everybody's got a tale. And some of them are too ridiculous for words, because it was such a big moment in everybody's life. The memory has this very clever way of being able to... I can't tell you what I had for dinner last night. Can you? Do you remember?
No.
There you go. Right, between three of us, we're not doing very well. But I'm sure we all ate. But what were we doing on the 26th of May 1989? I can remember virtually everyone I spoke to, what people said, what I was wearing, and believe me, that was really bad.
Was it baggy? What was it? Put in your boot, didn't you?
Red Dr. Martens, yellow socks, kind of those bad jeans that everyone had at the time with roll-ups.
Yeah,
I think I had the yellow I'm an Away Gunner T-shirt on, which I still have. The red home shirt of the season. It wasn't a great look. But everything was very baggy then. You look at pictures and it's like, my God. But anyway, this clarity of recall is really, really amazing. What you were eating, what you were drinking, what you saw in the finite detail. And so I decided to see if I could gather some stories. And essentially, the idea behind it is that I call this a footballing JFK moment. Everyone knows where were you when. And by getting this kind of diaspora of memories, what it enables us to do is create a kind of collage of what everyone was doing at the time in the 1980s.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of the book, obviously it is really important that you've got the inside track from the players and the staff and the managers and the people who were there, but also the fan side of it as well. I thought that was really, really interesting, not least because I know a few of the people in the book, but there's some really cracking stories there, aren't there?
But going back to that one you said at the beginning, so I basically put a tweet out saying, has anyone got any, which you ignored? Has anyone got any good, good memories? And things started coming in on the emails, and sometimes I was opening these emails and just my mind was blown. And there was this one particular guy who it really just moved me to tears straight away, and I subsequently sent it to some of the players who had a pretty similar reaction. I think it was powerful for them too to see that impact, that something they were involved in, something so sort of celebratory, had such a deep impact on an individual person's life. And this was a guy who'd given up. He was an addict in a really, really bad way, and he was offered a ticket to the game, and actually his self-esteem was so low that he couldn't even bear to go. He couldn't even bear to see his old mates, which is heartbreaking, really. And sat on his own in some room somewhere, in his own words, didn't really know if he wanted to live or not. And seeing that moment and him being an Arsenal fan and being able to connect with it in a personal way just inspired him to have hope for his life and reconnect with his family and try and be happy again, which is just shows you the extraordinary power, not just of sport, but sometimes of things that are not in your direct world. You don't, you do something, you don't realise somebody somewhere might be really touched by it. It's brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was a really powerful opener, as I say. Then literally turning the page, and next page is Thierry Henry giving a bit of a forward as well. That wasn't bad either, was it?
Well, that was it. I mean, if somebody said to me, why Thierry Henry? Like, what's he got to do with 89? Or as I said to my boy the other day when he was debating something, what's that got to do with the price of fish? He said, what's that got to do with a what of what? But anyway. Thierry, we spoke to for the film, and he gave the killer line at the end about it being the best finish to a league season ever, period. And what's meaningful about that, obviously, is that here's a guy from France who in 1989 was very, probably didn't know a great deal about Arsenal, probably didn't have that experience of seeing it at the time. But he became connected to it because when he joined the club, the direct legacy of that team, of the George Graham way, of Tony Adams, Lee Dixon, Nigel Winterburn, Steve Bold, and others who followed them, who basically, in his words, taught him what it was to be an Arsenal player, what was needed. It meant something to him as a historical moment, but also in that I don't think he feels his career would have turned the way it turned without the influence of those guys.
Yeah, absolutely. It was really powerful for lots of reasons. We've got a lad, De Roche, who's on the podcast and various other bits and pieces, and we were sort of talking to him. He's only like 21, and he really connected with the 89 side because of Thierry Henry in the film at the end, because he said he really wasn't expecting him to sort of appear. So hopefully that will have the same effect in the book. I'm sure it will. You obviously unrivaled contacts with people in and around the club. It just makes for such good reading, such sort of insightful reading. You've obviously got George Graham. I've interviewed George Graham once, and it was an absolute honour and a privilege and a pleasure to talk to him, because he was someone I looked up to as a 17-year-old that season.
Didn't everyone?
Absolutely. He was God for me, and a tough one and that as well sometimes. But what was it like talking to George Graham, interviewing George Graham for the book?
Phenomenal and immensely rewarding. And I kind of rewind to the first phone call about the 89 sort of revival, if you like. And George, in his life now, he has got much more of a distance. He still loves his football. He's still a consumer of it and an expert in it in his special way. But he wasn't sure about revisiting the past. It's not really his way. I mean, even at the time, when you think about how George behaved on the night, and how difficult it was for him to let go and express his emotions, and he even says that one of his regrets was that he didn't allow himself to show more emotion at the time. All that kind of like calm down stuff, which I'm sure had a connection with Hillsborough for obvious reasons. But he was a reserved guy. I mean, if he wanted you to know what he was feeling, you would know about it. But he didn't want to get too friendly with players, and he always liked things to keep a professional distance. He had that old school manager's way about him, and looking back, was just not what he ever did. It was kind of conditioned, and I think when I first rang and said, "How would you feel about doing something to do with 1989?" he said, well, he was reluctant, and we said, "Look, let's just meet up for a cup of coffee. Hear us out. Let's see what you think." And literally within about 2 minutes of sitting in a cafe in Hampstead, he's got the salt and pepper pots, and Brilliant. He warmed up so quickly. And it's one of the real pleasures of this whole experience is how I think it's reawoken in him some of the satisfaction for what he achieved and what he did. And for me, over there, a few hundred yards down the road at the Emirates Stadium, I think there should be a bit more George Graham around that stadium. Totally. A bit more of these guys should be celebrated. Should be revered more. They're on the pantheon. And what he achieved in 8 years there, plus his time as a player, this is a man who has done incredible things for that club. And you know all about the Cup Winners' Cup in '94. And for those of us who were around that time, I almost didn't have words a couple of years ago when people were saying, would you rather finish in the top four or get to Europa League final? And it's like, excuse me? Winning it. How many European trophies has this club won ever?
Since as well,
And for a club of this stature?
Absolutely.
And, he delivered one of the all-time great European moments. One on the pitch in 1970 and one from the tactical point of view in 1994, which was a miracle when you look at that game again, what that team achieved against an amazingly good Parma team. So, George is an icon for me of this club, and I hope that somewhere along the line, some of that love and affection and respect has been revived. That I think he deserves.
No, I really agree with Amy. Sorry to butt in.
Please do.
I've always had this argument with people, sort of like, this tendency to think that Arsenal started when Wenger came in, but I genuinely believe without George Graham and what he achieved, that kind of set the ball rolling. Without that, under George, we would not have that now.
Certainly the back four as well.
We've been languishing a long time without a league title. carried us back to the sort of forefront of football.
Yeah.
You know, especially against a team that dominated football for so long, like Liverpool.
Yeah.
I mean, I was growing up thinking these are the only team that were actually allowed to win the league. You know, it was getting so boring. For him to do that, you know, really sort of like started charting that map, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, anyone who was around the 80s, you just can't overstate the sort of the dominance that Liverpool had at the time. And for us to obviously go up there and win 2-0 was ridiculous. But it was a completely different time for the 80s. Reading that book again just really brought it back. And there was, for better or worse as well, I mean, I went to all the games as you did that season. And you talked movingly about the Everton away game and the stick that sort of Rocky got. Also, I think Master won 3-1. They got clapped off at the end, but there was a sort of...
They did. There was a standing ovation. It was like a spine-tingling moment because people, you're sitting there thinking, these lot have seen their team win the league because Everton had won it in the mid-80s. And to think it was like an extra pat on the back to think you're getting a standing ovation from an opposing team and these lot know about winning the title. But the other side of that coin was that the racist abuse that was commonplace in places like that at that time was staggering. Never heard anything like it in my life. Felt like the whole stadium.
I remember being in the away seats. Which
everyone was banging their seats.
And you evoke it so well, basically. But what I loved as well was the fact that, obviously, you know, David Rocastle, God rest his soul, was there. But I think Mickey Thomas was quoted, and he basically said, we weren't having that. We were going to stand up. We were all together. There was a real sort of esprit de corps, and Arsenal showed what they were about, basically, that day. And I think they grew a lot that day. They grew a lot all season, but that day, especially having read that in the book as well.
But there was a lot of away games that season. When you think, and actually, I think if you look at the stats, that the away record was slightly better, superior to the home record that season, which was unusual. And I think it underpinned what that team was all about. They relished it. You know, George Graham talks about how when you go away from home, you're always going to have a few warriors, you know, soldiers who will carry the troops, but you can't carry too many. You know, you need enough. That Tony Adams always used to say, you need 7 out of a team to go away from home and have a chance. And this team had more than 7. Really. I mean, they were partly because they were so hungry, because either they've come from the youth system and they've grown up in the club and they've grown up together. And they were fearless, a bit like, you know, you look at Joe Willock, way he conducts himself. Look at Saka, you know, Emile Smith-Rowe. The boys coming through, they're not scared. They're less scared than the older players half the time. I mean, because that's part of being young and hungry and thinking you can achieve anything. Because why couldn't you? And then the other guys who come in have been at Stoke or Wimbledon or Watford or Sheffield Wednesday, and with all due respect to all these football clubs, as George Graham says, you know, when he invited these people into the marble halls to come and sign, this is the Arsenal, and people, he wanted people to go, Arsenal, and they did, and it created in that team a desire that they had an energy within them, and they loved going away from home into the lion's den, like Tony Adams used to call it. Come on, he always preferred it. It's probably better having those kind of games in the same way that, you know, fans say, "Oh, I love going away," you know, atmosphere, and it feels different, and that's what those players felt back then. And going away then was hairy.
Well,
it was hairy for fans. It was hairy for players. It was a different age. It wasn't as comfortable as the football we know today on the whole. So you either love it or you're going to find it a bit overwhelming, and our boys loved it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was that 2-1 victory at Millwall where...
that's one of the great stories, though. In that again, one of the secret stories that everyone knows about, the referee being mic'd up, and that's fairly well documented. But Tony Adams turned around and said what he remembers about that day was sitting in the bath at the Den with Dave O'Leary after the game, the pair of them in these funny little baths. And Dave O'Leary said, going to win the league, you know. It's February.
I'd never heard that story before.
I'd never heard that before. And Tony Adams is saying it like this. And he said, O'Leary goes to him, you come to places like this and everything goes against you and you get a result like that, you're going to win the league. You can do it this year.
Do you think
and Tony Adams said the fact that he's remembered that memory for 30 years means something. It means that...
It's one of those moments.
You know... and those are the things that the little nuggets that you try and put a load of them together to create this whole which hopefully portrays the the energy and the stories of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I interviewed Jill Armstrong last week, and she talks about the sort of camaraderie and the bond of 71 double winning sides. It certainly shines through with the 89 team in your book. Just all that, Lee Dixon, obviously Tony Adams, all of them. There was a real just love and affection and respect there, wasn't there? And there was a real tough cause. Well, like you say, more than 7 players out of the 11.
Nigel Winterburn, you know, there's plenty. You don't have to look very far in that team. But,
Yeah, absolutely. Just in terms of, obviously, you know, it was a momentous season. It was a seismic season as well. Arsenal sort of faltered around March time. Obviously, football became secondary on the 15th of April 1989 with Hillsborough. But the way your book treats it is so sensitive. I just thought it was perfect, basically, with that letter from Laura Lawrence.
Yep.
I know Laura as well through
Okay.
Twitter and stuff. And she's written for the Sheffield Star, and she's a big Sheffield Wednesday fan.
yes.
And that sort of letter, that sort of...
It was a very, very moving piece of writing. I remember reading it a few years ago when she first published it, and it knocked me up sideways because it came at that story that tragically we all know far too well, and it's far too painful and far too raw even now. And she came at it from a completely different angle that I'd never even heard of before, because she was expressing it as her memories as a 10-year-old child, and as a local resident of Sheffield who saw everything from the outside. That in the, you know, the people walking down the street and coming into their house to use the telephone or get a cup of tea, and the state of the Liverpool fans who, you know, her father literally went and hauled them off the street to come and phone their family or whatever, because again, in a way that symbolises how different life is nowadays compared to 30 years ago. It seems odd that you can't contact someone instantly or be contacted instantly, but of course that wasn't the case back then, and for something so horrific for so many people to have been in a situation where getting in touch with loved ones was absolutely paramount, and there was no obvious way to do so. It's deeply, deeply touching, and I've always felt that you can't talk about Anfield '89 without talking about Hillsborough. I can't really think about it one without the other. They're absolutely entwined in my experience, and it was a tough one to think how to balance, you know, respectfully portraying what was happened. You know, but it was, I was very conscious. I'm not the person to write a Hillsborough book either, so it was really difficult, and that was one of the reasons why it feels quite an Arsenal-centric book, because how could you go and talk to Bruce Grobbelaar or John Barnes or Ray Houghton and ask them about, you know, in a way it would be fascinating to talk about the game from both sides of the story, but how can you talk to them about a game of football at the end of that season without talking to them about Hillsborough? And, you know, there's some brilliant literature about Hillsborough that needs to be read. I would recommend to anybody.
Phil Scrafton, Hillsborough Truth,
Absolutely. But you know, it was important to try and get that bit as right as humanly possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the players were incredible, because the players were able, again, I think older and wiser and with more life experience behind them, to articulate how they felt about it. And that was very, again, it's looking at it slightly from the outside looking in. But I often thought to myself, how did they feel? Did they feel, should we win the league? Still? Should we still be playing football? I mean, I think we all thought that.
Yeah.
I know I did. I know it was a big kind of internal wrestling match.
Well, I thought the season was going to be cancelled.
Well, I think most people did, and I don't think anybody would have complained particularly had it been so.
Yeah, absolutely.
But meanwhile, everyone gets back to it, and you end up in this situation on the last day where you can win it or they can, and they've had the biggest sporting tragedy that anyone can remember, and it's so fresh, and it was really complicated emotionally.
Yeah, but what I liked in the book as well, and I thought what I thought worked very well in the film, it was brilliant. I loved the film 100%, but there wasn't a sort of Liverpool angle in the book. You've actually sort of talked to a few Liverpool fans, and I thought that was perfect, basically. I thought that would really work well.
Well, that was another thing that came through the miracles of Twitter. You know, I put the tweet out, and a few people from Liverpool said, "Well, do you want to hear from me?" And I said, "Well, if you're willing to, I'd love to."
Yeah.
And you know, their pain is really important to put across.
Yeah, absolutely. I just thought it went really well. Obviously, returning to the football, Norwich City, 1st of May, 5-0. There was a 2-week gap. But before that, before I forget, you actually paid a visit to Anfield, didn't you?
That's right.
On the 23rd of April.
That was when the original game was scheduled.
And I didn't know that. I mean, why would I know? But I'd never seen you write about it or mention it before.
No.
But that was incredibly moving, you mentioning that as well.
Well, I was supposed to be going to the game on its original date.
Yeah.
And I, like a lot of people at that time, and we were a similar age, I think, you know, something unspeakably awful happens and it's deeply affecting. And obviously it was Liverpool's tragedy, and to an extent Sheffield and Nottingham were very involved. But I felt like it was football's tragedy as well. And you couldn't really say that because it wasn't our place to, but it hurt everybody like hell. And I felt like I couldn't really do anything for a while at that time. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to process it. But I just felt like I needed to do something. So I just went into school and did an assembly and collected money for the Hillsborough Disaster Fund and got about £200 donated from our school. And I thought, well, I think I'll just take it up there and lay my scarf. You were seeing all the TV images of the cop covered in flowers and scarves and stuff, and I don't know, it was like a magnet. It was like something was pulling me and I had to go. And I didn't know what to do because I'd never been to Anfield and I was a 17-year-old girl and I just was a bit clueless. And I thought, couldn't make my mind up because I'm really indecisive. Yeah. And then I just woke up on that day, it was a Sunday when we were supposed to be playing, and I just grabbed this cash and my revision books because I had A-levels as well, and just went down to Euston and got on a train. Sat with a guy who was going up for a funeral, a Liverpool fan. We chatted like on the way up, and it was really amazing because he was met at the station by a few of his mates, and they just took me under their wing for the day and took me with them to Anfield, and we were all in this queue together, which took about 4 hours.
You said it was the most well-behaved queue you'd ever
never seen anything like that in my life. Yeah. It was everybody. Yeah, it was. It was extraordinary. Yeah, and it was kind of almost spine-tingly, quite sort of bizarre, but it was around about kick-off time. I was actually in the away terrace where I should have been watching the game with my laying down my Arsenal scarf. I wrote something on the wall somewhere. I don't know. But there you go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I just make a point?
Sorry.
Please.
That's a great story. And it sort of goes in tandem. What people sort of Toby's age won't realise, you were quite reviled for actually liking football in that era.
Yeah, and that
I was at university, and I was treated like a pariah if you had the audacity in the Union building to put Match of the Day on a Saturday night. And that's as a bloke. How was it for you as a young girl, sort of like saying, I'm going to go to away games?
There was that passage when was it Villa Park when you accidentally kicked a policeman?
Yes, yeah.
Accidentally, she said.
One of my stories, yeah, I know. No, it was accident, genuinely accidental, but hey. It was, I mean, you were definitely more in the minority then than now, that's for sure. And obviously conditions were a bit less conducive. I mean, I do remember going to a baseball ground, there wasn't a ladies' toilet. Yeah. It was like I went at half time to go to the loo and there wasn't one. Like, okay. So it was a bit different, but actually that was something that it was part of the sort of attraction of football. Yeah. I was a bit of a rebel, and it was like, because it wasn't the place where teenage girls were supposed to go, I was like absolutely up for it, and I loved it. And I got to make friends with like-minded people, and I'd much rather be sat with a bunch of mates talking about football than going shopping to look for lip gloss or whatever my school friends were doing at the time, exactly. The girls were doing. So I found my place. And
it was all in tandem with music as well, wasn't it? Really?
For sure.
So I found music was quite tribal then, as well as football. And so I mean, I was presuming over your two passions, over my two passions.
Yeah, absolutely,
well.
big time.
Go around in hand and forget everything else.
Yeah, it's great. It was escaping from, the 80s was not the easiest time. I know we're not in easy political times in a different way nowadays, but 80s was a challenge, and a lot of people found their escape through football and music, especially if you were young. You had that energy of belonging to something.
Yeah, I mean, there was a brilliant piece you wrote about mixtape, taking it to a game before. Obviously, not in the book as far as I know, but that was quite a cool piece. You'd sort of go to away games and you have your mixtape.
I mean, you get a lucky tape, and then you had to keep listening to it. That's for sure. You know.
I know. I sort of tell my kids about tape, and they're like, "What does that mean?" But yeah, obviously back to football. Obviously, 1st of May, Arsenal beat Norwich City 5-0. Football's paid its respects after Hillsborough, as it did in '89. Middlesbrough away was the game after that. I remember going.
Did you go?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, remember them throwing carrots at Tony Adams when he went to the Holgate.
Don't get back to that.
Oh yeah, no, but yeah, I'm thinking late Martin Hayes goal got the winner, and then that sets us up for Derby on the Saturday. I think it was the 13th of May, and I think if we'd have won that, me and Glenn were sort of talking about it before, if we'd have won that game that day and Liverpool had lost, we'd have won the league that day. And just the way you're bringing all the sort of the crescendo of the story, the narrative together in the book, it's so powerful because we've won it basically, haven't we? Derby County at home, we're not going to lose to them, are we?
Well, I thought the way that the players remembered that week was pretty spectacular because, you know, from their point of view, I think Lee Dixon articulated it well when he was talking about how they felt. Liverpool seemed so experienced, and suddenly all that inexperience of Arsenal, it was like the youthful enthusiasm could only carry them so far, and then it got to a point where they felt like they got exposed.
Yeah.
And, you know, and Liverpool were a winning machine, which was even more extraordinary under the circumstances in the aftermath of Hillsborough, but they were just winning and winning and winning and winning. And I think, you know, it had to be the pressure of expectancy and not having done it before. 18 years, and you've got a couple of home games to try and wrap up the league title. It was, you know, that was... they talk about the lap of honour after the Wimbledon game, and, you know, feeling... Some of the players said they felt like they let people down, which obviously that was my memory of it.
I
think everybody thought, you know, God, guys, you've done so well,
Giving it a good go.
but I don't think people. I mean, can you imagine it today?
I was going to say, yeah.
Apart from the fact there'd be nobody there anyway, but also there'd be loads of screaming and abuse, and you know, God knows. I mean, it did feel like, and that's something that Tony Adams articulates brilliantly also in the book about how the players felt like they and the fans were all part of the same thing. And that's something I think that has been a bit lost with the mist of time. But in that era, I think everybody felt like they were in the same gang.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
like going up to Middlesbrough, you
Yeah.
sort of meet other Arsenal fans and be like, well, how do we get to the ground? Where's the local pub? You'd be in it together, basically.
yeah, but the players felt like they were part of that as
Yeah,
well.
yeah,
They didn't
absolutely.
feel like they were above and you know separated.
Some sort of
They
rivalry.
felt like that everyone was in that
Yeah,
same.
we were the Arsenal, basically, the fans, players, the club, everything, yeah. There was a real sense of that. You really evoked that well, and obviously through the interviews. Obviously for the 2-2, there was a really good piece about, I can't remember which player said it, but it was like, Paul McGee scored. Never heard of him before, never heard of him afterwards, basically.
No.
Obviously,
I think he was making his debut, the kid.
Was he really?
Yep,
Yeah,
and he
blimey.
honestly disappeared within 6 months.
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
unbelievable.
We
Just
have
had
a
like.
lot of that over the years.
He used to goalkeepers though, isn't it?
So obviously, yeah, in terms of the build-up, I remember, like you say about JFK moment, it's amazing what sort of details you remember. I remember the Tuesday night, obviously, was a Wimbledon game at home, Highbury 2-2. I think we've lost it. I was still convinced we had a little chance until the Wednesday when Liverpool played West Ham at Anfield. And I remember studying for my A-level history. I love history normally. And we were learning about this really dry subject, the Chartists, if you're vaguely interested. And it was so dry and so boring. I remember listening to Radio 2, as it would have been then, with a game. And it was like 1-0, 2-0. Okay, we can still just need to go there and win 1-0. And then West Ham just collapsed, basically. It was 5-0. And I just remember feeling, we're not going to do it. We've lost. That's it. It's all over. You know, the whole season's gone thanks to West Ham. And I've always wanted to beat West Ham for that reason more than anything else ever since. But I mean, that's just me. But there was a real sort of, again, it's just so powerful. It's a story that's been told a million times, but your book makes it fresh and original, the way you've sort of put it together. And
Well, but that's the joy of an oral history, that you can get, you know, Perry Groves recalling being in a, you know, whatever it was, down a pub or Indian takeaway or whatever it was, and ringing up whichever player he rang to have have a, you know, it's gone now. And Lee Dixon was out for a meal with his wife.
Was that Liverpool fan?
And the waiter was a Liverpool fan, kept coming out, oh, another goal, mate, another goal. And Lee was like, oh. And Nigel said he was just sat at home on the floor, listening to the radio, like on his own, like in a dark mood. And I think there was a PFA dinner going on, and Alan Smith was there, and the goals are sort of rolling in, and it just, everybody was remembering exactly where they were and what they were doing. And it did seem impossible until a day or two after they're back at the training ground, and Bob Wilson pops his head round, sees a few miserable faces and says, "Come on, lads, what's wrong with you? This is the week we win the league."
Good old Bob.
And I'd not even heard that story. I've interviewed Bob, and he's an amazing bloke through Willow, and he's been an Arsenal legend, but I'd not heard that story. That's absolutely fantastic. He said that. And Alan Swift sort of comes out with dry sort of, "Are you sure, Bob?" Sort of.
But it changed something in people. I mean, sometimes you just need a little something that someone says, and it comes from an unexpected place, and it makes you go, "Oh, okay." Yeah. And I think they all complimented as well George's genius in his planning of how he managed that period of time, because it was from the Tuesday, there was quite a bit of time to go, and. Gave him a couple of days off, and then they came in, and it was all very light, kept everything very, very relaxed, and even the decision to go up on the day of the game, which is highly unusual. I don't think had ever been, was totally out of routine. And Paul Johnson, the travel manager, him saying that Theo Foley came over and said, "Right, well, we're going to go up on Friday." He went, "Oh, yeah, right." It's like, no, George wants to go up on Friday. And I was like, "What are you talking about?" Like, Friday, what if there's a traffic jam, etc. What if the coach breaks down? What if you can't have no contingency? You can't go up on Friday. And it's like, George wants to go on Friday. Okay, we'll go on Friday. So I mean, just everything in hindsight, every decision George made was perfection.
I mean, going back to February in the bath with O'Leary and Tony Adams. I wonder if David thought that day would be part of the back three centre halves. When we're chasing a 2-0 win.
That United people talk about tactics nowadays as if it's just been invented, but George played three centre halves that day at United.
And he did it at United for one reason. Not to play against United. He did that as a practice to do against Liverpool. Because the Liverpool game in its original form was supposed to be a couple of weeks later. And he thought it was trip up north, big team. United weren't as good as Liverpool then, but a good way to have a go at practicing. And he designed this system specifically with a view to isolating Barnes and Houghton on the wings so that the balls didn't get to centre forwards. Push up at full-backs, have an extra defender in the middle. He had it all sussed out.
Yeah. I mean, it was 3-4-3, I think, but obviously with the two fullbacks played so far up, they were making midfielders. But that could easily turn back into a 5-4-1 if you needed to, if everyone dropped back a level. So it was revolutionary at the time, wasn't it?
Monster strike. Retrospectively, obviously. On the night, I was going, what?
Well, this is, I mean, George said himself, like, everybody said, you've got to attack, you've got to throw on more attackers, attack. You need 2 goals at Anfield. And he's like, I don't think so. We're not conceding a goal. Like, and then we suddenly need 3. Are you mad? He's just he was one step ahead of everybody. Psychologically, tactically, mentally, the whole shebang. He just made decision after decision that turned out to be immaculate.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. I love the psychology of it when he was like, "Right, lads, half time, 0-0. That's exactly what we want. We don't want to score too early." And you're like, some of the players are sort of looking at each other and recounting in the book, obviously, just like, "What's the on about?" sort of thing. But they all bought into it, whether they believed it or not. But
well, I think the fact they all bought into George anyway. I don't think there were many dissenting voices then.
You wouldn't last long if that was the case.
No, and that was part of why he felt he could do the things that he did, because he knew that they would do what he said. And that was part of the reason why he cleared out the guys who he felt were prima donnas and got in people he felt would listen to him, and they did. And the rewards were unbelievable.
Absolutely. I mean, I love the way you sort of intersperse Brian Moore's sort of iconic commentary, and every Arsenal fan knows it or should know it, basically, and you're sort of flicking in between the sort of quotes from the players and the way the ball's moving up the pitch, and Brian Moore sort of, the ball's getting to take Nicky Thomas, basically. I love that. Must have been fun writing it.
It was, and it was just. I always feel whenever I've written almost about that game is that you have to use Brian Moore's words because they're the best words, and there's not much point in anyone else trying to do a variation because it won't be as good as Brian Moore. And actually, I was part of the joy of doing this was to try and speak to lots of other people outside of the predictable one. So I spoke to David Pleat, for example, who was very generous in giving his time on this subject because he knows how he's perceived, particularly with Fever Pitch and so on.
I did like the way it was sort of phrased. Well, his quote obviously was. Obviously, the Arsenal fans know about the poetic justice line, and they've all got their own views. I've got mine as well. But he did say he would have said it slightly differently if he'd have sort of had his time again, really. So we'll give him his due for that. But that was a really iconic moment as well. The fact you got him in the book, I thought that was really good.
Yeah.
Though I didn't know at the time was Jim Rosenthal. When you talk about Kenny Dalglish and the time afterwards, just about to talk to the referee and say, that first goal was offside or wasn't. There wasn't a touch from Smith. And Jim Rosenthal pops his head round and goes, "It was a goal," and that was it basically. But that must have been.
Well, the referee, talking to the referee was superb. He's great, really, really. Exactly what the kind of person you'd like a referee to be. Nowadays, and he, what I thought was incredible was that he'd never even met the linesman that he worked with that night.
But the fact you sort of swirled that out of nowhere, that was a great stat.
What?
Great face.
And so after the Alan Smith goal and they're having this tete-a-tete, and the referee explained that part of him doing that was just to buy some time. It wasn't even specifically that he wasn't sure. It was like today with VAR or whatever. It was, he pretty much thought he'd seen what he'd seen, but just he had this pressure of being surrounded by so many players. And he just went to buy some time. But obviously the questions that he asked of the linesman back there were really, really important. And these were two guys who never ever worked together on a football pitch before or since. Like the whole world's watching, and the championship's at stake. It's just amazing.
I liked his instruction when he said, "Just run back to the halfway line." After the goal, basically. But and again with Jim Rosenthal, when you talk about the ref coming in after, he's convinced he's got it right, but he's until you sit on TV, you're not 100% sure. And Jim Rosenthal's going,
Do you think you felt under any moral pressure to sort of add a bit more time?
The ref? I don't think so. I really got the impression that he was a scrupulously fair, lovely man trying to do his job well. I didn't get any sense with him that.
Position to be in.
Absolutely.
I've got a blow now.
I know, at the end of such a momentous seismic season in the game as well. But I loved a bit about. I sort of heard about this sort of champagne being sort of given to. I think it was a referee actually. I'm not sure if I knew that bit. But
I think there was a lot of champagne knocking around, so it ended up in different places than where it was probably really intended. That was amazing. Niall Quinn said that. Niall Quinn remembered that I think a few of the Liverpool people had come in and bought some of their champagne in for the Arsenal and said, "We don't need it, you may as well have it." And they were all spraying this stuff around, doing the whole Formula One thing, and these bottles actually say Liverpool FC Champions 1989. Now, because Barclays, who were the sponsors, had obviously produced some, a crate or so for both eventualities. And Quinny said, like, what idiots? Like, why didn't we keep them? Like, can you imagine what that would be?
And it's almost the throwaway lines I love as well. Someone said, there was a sort of dignitary from Barclays in the changing room afterwards, and he's got his own Barclays trophy, and everyone just sort of ignored that and went for the old iconic stylish Division 1 title. But it's stuff like that really, really brings the story to life again, basically, and it's just an amazing book. But on top of that as well, you've got the fans. You've got the section of the fans afterwards, and it's not like every fan. I was there. It's the sort of stories because they weren't there that almost made it more interesting.
I preferred the stories of the people who weren't there because obviously ones are coming into people who were there, and people who were there mostly had the same sort of story. Got stuck in traffic, kind of just about got there, or we were late. Rushing to the ground. Same sort of feelings of euphoria, obviously, and a few people. Although there were some of the stories from people who were there that I thought were fairly extraordinary, where people seemed to jib their way onto the pitch and stuff. I thought, wow, hello, that was pretty cool. Some guy had probably a camera about this big, and And so, like, was it got on with all the photographers? And you're like, what? And he sent me a couple of his photos, and they're a bit rubbish, obviously, but they're just the angle just a bit to the side of all the official photographs that you've ever seen. Yeah. This guy's just jumped on, and the steward's gone, go on then. And you're like, oh, wow. But how about the fact that 3 or 4 of the Arsenal players were behind the goal?
Yeah.
You know, members of the squad. Malcolm, Paul Davis, Brian Marwood. Yeah. They did, you know, their tickets when they turned up. They were, you're in the Arsenal then. And when it got to the last few minutes, they went down. They were quite near the front. Yeah. In fact, I think one of them recalls Bruce Grobbelaar taking the mick during the game with them. Yeah. Just like, you know, like looking around, you know, that's right. Like, what are you doing there? And it just seems incredible. And then they were thinking, well, what do we do? Because at the end, we've got to get, bear in mind, Arsenal are winning 1-0, but losing the league, if you like, with the dying moments or a couple of minutes before. And they're thinking, we need to get back round to the dressing room. We need to get round to the tunnel. Like, how do we get? And they were trying to get round the periphery of the pitch because they were right near a gate. Yeah. And the stewards went down to talk to a steward and say, can we just walk round the side of the pitch just to get back to the, you know, to the bench and the dressing room? And the steward's like, you know, and what are you on about? And they're all in their club suits and ties, and the fans around them are going, they're the players. Like, what more do you need to you know? Yeah. And in the end, they let him through, and they were halfway back towards the dugout when Lukic throws the ball out to Dixon. I mean, so if you're not going to be on the pitch, they were as close as damn it. Pretty amazing.
Absolutely. But like I mean, it's about the fans. Well, there's a brilliant story about you sort of unearthed from a fan who was in Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin. I read that.
It was Checkpoint Alpha.
Right, okay, right.
It was a really phenomenally interesting story. So this guy Arsenal fan, had been just joined the army and had been billeted out to Germany before the fall of the wall, which happened a little bit later in 1989. And Checkpoint Charlie is the one everyone knows. And then there's Checkpoint Beta, I think, and Checkpoint Alpha was the one that was the furthest east in
it's all West Berlin.
So
east.
Yeah, and it was really quite isolated, and they were so far away from the majority of everything else that they couldn't pick up sort of British Forces radio and so on. So trying to get an idea of what was happening in real time was basically impossible. And this guy was like, what am I going to do? How am I going to find out? And he met some guy who was a soldier who was a Rangers fan, and he knew someone in a nearby town, and they ended up basically sorting out a situation where this person's friend would video the game, and this guy would drive and meet him and pick up the video to take back to the barracks where there was a communal video room. It could stick the VHS in and watch it. And he said he drove, 2 hours through the night to whatever town it was. He said he didn't exchange words. It was like, don't want to know what's happened. No, I didn't even look. Took the video, went back to his barracks and watched it. And at about 3 or 4 in the morning, he's there with a can of beer and this VHS in his hand, like. But there were people all over the world that didn't know what was going on because big matches were not relayed. They were barely relayed live in England. Yeah. Never mind around the rest of the world.
Football and was just not a phenomenon.
Then.
Yeah.
I mean,
Kev from the Gooner editor, the ridiculous story. He
went to the Champions League final.
Went to the Champions League final and ended up in sleeping in the car by some ditch or whatever. And couldn't waiting for the World Service and all that sort of stuff on the radio. You had to wait for the actual news bulletin.
Yeah. Well, that was the thing as well. It was just the fact that if you're watching on TV as well, I've seen sort of copies of it afterwards, and it's like literally it was like Elton Wellesby, and he just goes, "Yeah, Arsenal win the league. There you go. There's a trophy. Now news at 10," and that was it. You literally had 5 minutes. Not even that. The brilliant Spurs were advert. Nowadays they've been talking about it for weeks, probably all summer at least, weren't they?
Well, some of us were talking about it all summer. But
absolutely. But yeah, it's such a good book. If you've not come across it yet, you've got to buy it. It's an essential must-read for all Arsenal fans and football fans in general as well, because the narrative is just incredible. And if you don't know the story, obviously you should know the story, but if you don't know the story, it's worth reading itself just to get to that climax. It's absolutely fantastic. Amy Lawrence,
thanks, Layth.
You're an absolute legend as ever. Huge respect for something as I always say. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers, Amy.
Cheers, cheers, Glenn.
Cheers, Amy.
Brilliant.
Hey guys, please subscribe to Gooner Fanzine TV.